In the heart of Chicago, beneath the towering glass giants that defined the city's skyline, a young man, Ken Griffin, sat in a dimly lit room, staring at the chaotic stock tickers on his screen. At just 19, his mind raced, far beyond the typical thoughts of an ordinary college student. Griffin had always been different. While his peers worried about homework and social gatherings, he focused on one thing: mastering the market. With a genius for numbers and a fearless drive, he quickly realized that money didn't just move in the world, it flowed through it. He had a dream, a vision, and the courage to chase it, regardless of the cost. As the markets buzzed, Ken Griffin saw not a world of chaos, but a realm of endless opportunity. Yet, the stakes were high, and the game was ruthless. But for someone like Griffin, there was no such thing as fear, only strategy. Ken's journey was no ordinary one. He wasn't just chasing wealth, he was hunting for something more elusive, something far greater. The market to him was a puzzle, and with every move he made, he got closer to solving it. Yet he wasn't alone in this race. As he sat in that small room, his every move was being watched by others, financial giants who had spent decades building their empires. To them, Griffin was an unknown, a kid with big ideas. But in his heart, Ken knew this was his moment. The world didn't realize it yet, but it was on the verge of being turned upside down. He had seen the potential in the market and in himself. As the morning sun began to rise over the city, Griffin closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared for what was to come. The world was about to witness something extraordinary. Ken Griffin's name began circulating through Wall Street. Traders, investors, and market analysts started hearing whispers about the young man from Chicago who was shaking things up. At first they dismissed him as another ambitious rookie, another dreamer in the vast sea of stockbrokers. But Griffin's unrelenting drive set him apart. He was no mere participant in the market, he was a disruptor. Soon he wasn't just making waves, he was creating a tsunami. The financial giants had to take notice, and some even tried to silence him. But Ken Griffin was no ordinary competitor. With every challenge, he grew stronger, more determined, and more innovative. The market had never seen anyone quite like him. He wasn't just playing the game, he was redefining the rules. The pressure was mounting, but so was Griffin's reputation. He was beginning to outshine even the most seasoned traders, and this did not sit well with everyone. The more successful he became, the more enemies he made. Wall Street is not a place for the faint-hearted, and Griffin was learning that the hard way. However, what others saw as obstacles, Griffin saw as opportunities. He understood that in this world, to get ahead, you must not only predict the future, you must control it. This mindset would soon be the key to his success. With each passing day, his name became synonymous with one thing: success. But with success came an undeniable truth. The higher you rise, the harder you fall. But Griffin was undeterred. With every setback, his resolve only strengthened. He knew that in order to achieve greatness, he would have to face the most intense battles of his career. The road to success was paved with risks, and Griffin was ready to take them. As the weeks turned into months, the young trader's reputation grew. He was no longer just a name on a screen, he had become a force to be reckoned with. Yet, with each victory, the stakes grew higher. Soon Griffin would find himself at the center of a financial storm that could either make him a legend or bring his empire crashing down. As the months passed, Ken Griffin's influence in the world of finance grew exponentially. His name became synonymous with innovation, precision, and strategy. He was no longer just a promising trader. He had evolved into a market disruptor. Griffin wasn't content with merely following trends. He created them. His relentless pursuit of knowledge, paired with a deep understanding of market dynamics, allowed him to predict movements others couldn't even fathom. Every decision was calculated, every risk meticulously analyzed. The financial giants who once overlooked him were now watching every move he made. They saw his potential, but they also feared what he might become. Griffin was rewriting the rules of the market, and in doing so, he was carving out a place for himself among the elite. The transformation of Griffin's career wasn't just about financial success. It was about power. He began to realize that with his increasing wealth and influence came the opportunity to reshape the very fabric of the financial markets. He invested in technologies that could give him an edge, developing sophisticated algorithms and artificial intelligence systems that outpaced anything his competitors had. As the speed of trading grew faster and more competitive, Griffin wasn't merely keeping up, he was setting the pace. The media took notice, with headlines proclaiming him a genius and the future of finance. But even as the praise mounted, Griffin knew that the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Every victory in the market attracted more scrutiny, more eyes on him, and with that, more potential threats. The pressure from Griffin's success began to mount. His rapid ascent in the financial world didn't go unnoticed by his rivals. Behind the scenes, whispers turned into plots, and those who once underestimated him began to see him as a threat. As Griffin's strategies proved successful, financial institutions started implementing measures to counteract his growing influence. But Griffin wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He welcomed the competition, knowing it would push him to innovate further. However, the high stakes began to take their toll. His personal life started to feel the strain of his relentless drive. The long hours, the isolation, the constant pressure, it all began to seep into his every waking moment. And yet, he couldn't stop. He knew that in this world you either dominated or you were consumed. A sudden market downturn shakes the foundation of Griffin's strategies. For the first time, his carefully crafted plans seemed to be unraveling. Stocks he had once been so certain of began to plummet, leaving him with a mounting sense of uncertainty. His usual calm demeanor was now replaced with moments of doubt. The competitive world of finance had given him no room for error, and the pressure was suffocating. For a brief moment, Griffin questioned his own abilities, his strategies, and his place in this ruthless world. But even in this moment of vulnerability, his resolve remained unbroken. Griffin didn't retreat into fear. He turned inward, determined to find a new way to regain his footing. It was in this moment of crisis that he realized the true cost of his ambitions and the immense power of his own resilience. In the midst of the market turbulence, Griffin made a critical decision. He would double down. He took a step back, re-evaluating his strategy with the precision of a chess master. Instead of panicking, he began to look at the downturn as an opportunity. With calculated risks, he made moves that others deemed too bold. It was a gamble, but one that he was willing to take. And just as quickly as the markets had fallen, they began to recover, at least for Griffin. He was now more than just a player in the market, he was becoming a master of it. His decision to embrace risk paid off, solidifying his reputation as a financial genius. But even as he emerged from the crisis, the question lingered. How long could he continue to outsmart the market before it finally caught up with him? Ken Griffin's rise to prominence had attracted the attention of not just the media, but also powerful financial institutions that now saw him as a threat to the established order. His success was no longer just a story of one man's ambition. It had become a battleground for control over the market. Long-established players, who had once dismissed Griffin as a young upstart, now scrambled to figure out how to neutralize him. But Griffin, ever the strategist, was prepared. He had anticipated this move, and he was already several steps ahead. His calculated risks, however, now carried a greater price. The once clear path to victory was now fraught with new complexities. Rival firms were taking aggressive stances against him, using their vast resources to challenge his methods. Griffin's empire, which he had built with precision and foresight, was now at the mercy of an unforgiving financial landscape. Griffin's success had come at a price. With every move, the pressure mounted. He was faced with constant battles, inside the markets, in boardrooms, and with the media. The scrutiny on his every move became unbearable. At times it felt as though the walls were closing in. And while the financial world could never fully anticipate Griffin's next move, it was clear that he was no longer just playing a game, he was fighting for his very survival. The world around him had grown hostile. Journalists questioned his methods, Rivals plotted behind closed doors, and regulators started to scrutinize his every financial maneuver. Griffin, however, was unshaken. He understood the stakes of the game. But as the battles continued to intensify, he began to question. How far was he willing to push the boundaries of the financial system before it pushed back? The stakes escalated quickly. A critical moment arrived when Griffin found himself in the midst of an unprecedented market manipulation scandal. Someone, or perhaps some group, had been leaking his strategies to the press. The story began to unfold with explosive headlines, accusing him of using unethical methods to outsmart the market. The media frenzy was intense, with analysts and pundits questioning his integrity. But Griffin knew the truth. His strategies were legal, they were calculated, and they were designed to disrupt the market, not break it. As public sentiment turned against him, Griffin found himself on the defensive. The pressure was now not only financial, but personal. Every move he made was scrutinized under a microscope, and the market he had once dominated began to feel more like a prison. The scandal, though unwarranted, sent shockwaves through the market. Griffin's public image was tarnished, and rival firms saw this as their chance to take him down. Investors started to pull back, questioning whether they had made a mistake in backing his ambitious ventures. It was in these moments of crisis that Griffin's true character was revealed. He doubled down on his strategy, refusing to buckle under pressure. In private, his team rallied behind him, offering unwavering support. Together, they began to develop counter-strategies to win back public trust. But Griffin knew that the road ahead would be rough. His empire, once unassailable, was now vulnerable. And though the storm was far from over, he remained steadfast, because in his mind, failure was not an option. With his reputation hanging in the balance, Griffin knew that his next move would be the most crucial of his career. It was time to take risks that others wouldn't dare. The decision was made. He would launch an aggressive counteroffensive, using a series of strategic moves that would send shockwaves through the market. But this was more than just a financial maneuver. It was a statement. Griffin wasn't going to be cowed by public opinion, nor was he going to let the scandal define him. He pushed forward with an audacity that caught the attention of both allies and enemies alike. As his team worked tirelessly in the background, Griffin knew that success would either redeem him or mark the beginning of his downfall. In that moment, there was no middle ground. He had to win. The storm that had been brewing in the background finally broke with a devastating revelation. Ken Griffin was facing accusations of financial malpractice, with a new investigation into his trading practices, threatening to unravel everything he had worked for. A well-placed source had leaked critical information to the press, exposing a controversial deal involving Griffin's hedge fund and a series of highly questionable trades. As the media pounced on the story, the allegations became impossible to ignore. The markets reacted swiftly, plunging in response to the mounting uncertainty. Griffin's every move was now under the microscope, and he found himself in the unfamiliar position of defending his integrity. The financial world had once viewed him as a genius. Now, he was perceived as a potential fraud. But Griffin had faced adversity before, and he wasn't about to back down now. As the investigation unfolded, Griffin was bombarded by legal teams, financial regulators, and the media. Every phone call, every email, was scrutinized for signs of misconduct. His lawyers worked tirelessly to defend him, but the case against him was growing stronger. To make matters worse, there were whispers that someone within his inner circle had betrayed him, leaking crucial information to his competitors. A trusted ally was now considered a liability, and Griffin's empire began to fracture. He found himself surrounded by accusations and doubts, even as the truth remained shrouded in uncertainty. The relentless pressure began to take a toll on his mental and emotional state. Griffin had always prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, but now, the narrative seemed to be slipping away from him. And with it, his grip on everything he had built. The days felt like weeks, and the pressure seemed to mount with each passing hour. Griffin's world was collapsing in slow motion. Media outlets continued to report on the scandal, dissecting every move he made, and every decision he had ever taken. Meanwhile, rival firms began circling like vultures, waiting to pounce on the opportunity to take him down. It became clear that Griffin's enemies were using the scandal as a means to strip him of his influence and assets. But amidst the noise and chaos, Griffin remained focused. His mind worked like a machine, calculating each move with precision, just as he had done when he first entered the market. Yet, this was no longer just about profit or power. It was personal. Griffin now had something more to prove than ever before. He had to clear his name, not just for his career, but for his very legacy. As the investigation dragged on, a new twist emerged that no one had seen coming. A confidential whistleblower, someone inside one of the rival firms, came forward with damning evidence that not only cleared Griffin's name, but also revealed the true extent of the conspiracy against him. The leak wasn't just an isolated event, it was part of a calculated effort to bring him down. With this new revelation, the tables were turned. Griffin's enemies had underestimated him, thinking he would crumble under pressure. Instead, he emerged from the storm with newfound strength. The scandal had not destroyed him, it had made him more dangerous. Griffin was now armed with the truth, and that was a weapon no one could take from him. But as he read through the whistleblower's statement, a new realization struck: the fight was far from over. The people who had tried to take him down were still out there, and they weren't going to let him off easily. With the revelation of the whistleblower's testimony, Griffin regained his standing in the financial world. The charges against him were dropped, and the media's attention began to shift away from the scandal. However, the victory was bittersweet. Griffin realized that the forces that had conspired against him were still out there, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The world of high finance was not kind to those who had risen as quickly as he had, and it was a game that could change in an instant. Griffin understood that the cost of his success was a constant battle for survival. There would always be new challenges, new adversaries. But this time, he was ready. He had learned the hard way that in this world, you couldn't just rely on intellect and strategy. You had to be prepared for betrayal, deception, and the long game. And Griffin was more than ready to play it. The tension in the financial world had reached a boiling point. Ken Griffin stood at the precipice of everything he had worked for, knowing that the next decision he made could determine his future. After months of market volatility, legal battles, and personal strain, the time had come for a final, high-stakes move. Griffin had been meticulously planning this moment, and now, it was time to execute. The market was ripe for disruption, and Griffin knew exactly how to capitalize on the opportunity. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for wealth or power, he was fighting to redefine the financial landscape. If he succeeded, his name would be cemented in history as a visionary. But if he failed, he would lose everything: the empire, the reputation, and the legacy. Griffin's hands were steady as he made the call, knowing that in this game, there was no room for second chances. The market responded immediately. What had seemed like a calculated gamble now felt like a fight for survival. Griffin watched as the numbers moved faster than ever, his pulse racing with each fluctuation. His strategy was unfolding perfectly, but with each tick, there was the potential for everything to unravel. He had pushed all his chips onto the table, and now, it was a race against time. In the background, the media buzzed with speculation, while his competitors watched closely, waiting for him to falter. But Griffin remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on the data, his mind calculating every move with precision. The room was silent except for the steady hum of the computer monitors, but in that silence, the weight of the world pressed down on Griffin. He had come this far, he wasn't about to back down now. The finish line was in sight, but the path to victory was fraught with risk. As the minutes ticked by, Griffin's gamble began to pay off. The market shifted in his favor, and his strategy started to unfold with precision. The risk was enormous, but the rewards were equally vast. With each moment, the stakes grew higher, and Griffin felt the weight of his ambition pressing on him. The adrenaline was palpable as he watched the numbers climb. His reputation, once threatened by scandal, now seemed to be solidifying once again. He had managed to turn the tide, using his uncanny ability to predict market movements. But just as quickly as the market moved in his favor, a sudden shift occurred. The numbers began to fluctuate wildly, sending a wave of panic through his team. Griffin's hands gripped the edge of the desk, his eyes narrowing in concentration. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where everything could either fall into place or come crashing down. The volatility in the market reached a fever pitch, but Griffin remained calm, calculating each move with the precision of a surgeon. He knew that this was the defining moment of his career, the one that would either make him a legend or shatter his empire. With a steady hand, he initiated a series of complex trades, pushing the market to new heights. His rivals, once confident that they could take him down, now found themselves scrambling to keep up. The tide had turned in Griffin's favor, but the victory was bittersweet. He knew the game wasn't over. There were still threats looming in the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. But for now, Griffin had proven that he could outmaneuver them all. The markets were his domain, and he had reclaimed control. Yet, as he watched the final numbers settle, he understood the true cost of his success. Victory in this world came with constant sacrifice, and the battle was never truly over. As the dust settled, and the market returned to stability, Griffin knew that the challenges were far from over. The victory he had secured was monumental, but the fight for dominance in the financial world would continue. His rivals, now stung by his success, would be watching his every move, waiting for any opportunity to strike. Yet, Griffin felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that he had proven himself once again. The risks he had taken were calculated, and the results spoke for themselves. He had come out on top, not just financially, but as a symbol of resilience in a world where only the strongest survive. As he sat back in his chair, the weight of his accomplishments finally began to sink in. He had achieved greatness, but at what cost? The road ahead was uncertain, but Griffin was ready for whatever came next. In the world of finance, there was always another challenge on the horizon, and he was prepared to face it head-on. The aftermath of Griffin's victory was a strange blend of relief and reflection. While the financial world had acknowledged his brilliance, there was no true respite. The markets were still volatile, and every triumph seemed to be met with an equal, inevitable challenge. The cost of his success had been high, personally, financially, and emotionally. Relationships with his closest allies had been strained, and the isolation that had once driven him to achieve greatness now left him feeling adrift. Even as his empire grew, a sense of emptiness gnawed at him. The battle for dominance in the financial world had taken a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. He was no longer just the visionary who had conquered the market. He was a man haunted by the weight of his decisions. Griffin knew that success in this world came at a price, but he wasn't sure if the price had been worth it. As the dust settled, Griffin began to reevaluate his life and his legacy. He had conquered the market, but in doing so he had lost parts of himself. The relationships he had built over the years had deteriorated, and he found himself struggling with a profound sense of loneliness. Even his closest allies seemed distant, caught up in their own pursuits. Griffin had spent so much time focusing on the numbers, the strategies, and the victories, but he had neglected the human side of his journey. Now, as he looked around at the remnants of his empire, he wondered whether the price he had paid was worth the accolades. Was financial success enough, or had he sacrificed too much of what truly mattered? Griffin had always been driven by ambition, but now he was questioning what that ambition had cost him, and whether it had been worth the toll on his soul. As time passed, Griffin made a conscious effort to rebuild the parts of his life that had been neglected during his rise to the top. He started to reconnect with his family, friends, and even old colleagues, realizing that his previous focus on financial conquest had left him isolated. While the market still called to him, Griffin understood that balance was now the key to his survival. He had built an empire, but it was a fragile empire, one that needed more than just money and power to thrive. Griffin slowly began to understand that true success was not just about wealth. it was about finding fulfillment in all aspects of life. He began to delegate more of the day-to-day operations of his company, allowing him more time to focus on personal growth and meaningful connections. It was a difficult transition, but Griffin was determined to find peace amidst the chaos he had created. His journey, he now realized, was as much about self-discovery as it was about financial triumph. Despite the efforts to restore balance in his personal life, Griffin could never fully escape the pull of the financial world. The markets were constantly changing, and with them, so were the opportunities. Griffin realized that while he had taken a step back, the world he had built was constantly evolving, and he could not afford to be complacent. He had to stay ahead of the curve, if only to protect the legacy he had created. Yet, even as he returned to the markets, there was a new awareness within him. His focus was no longer solely on domination, but on strategic growth that allowed him to maintain control while finding peace within himself. Griffin knew that his future would never be the same as his past. The journey that had once been about conquest was now about balance and sustainability. For the first time in his career, he began to see the value in letting go, knowing when to push forward and when to pull back. Griffin's life, now in a more balanced state, had come full circle. He had achieved everything he once dreamed of: success, wealth, influence. But the true challenge had always been internal. The emotional cost of his journey was something he couldn't ignore, but it was also something he had learned to accept. Success in the financial world had taught him that life was a constant balancing act. As he looked back on his rise and fall, Griffin understood that he was no longer the same person who had started this journey. He had transformed both in terms of his professional achievements and his personal growth. He had discovered that there was more to life than being on top. Now, as Griffin looked out at the world he had shaped, he knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with who he had become, and that was the true victory. As the years passed, Ken Griffith's reputation in the financial world solidified, but so did his enemies. The higher one rises, the more powerful the forces that lurk beneath, waiting for an opportunity to strike. A familiar rival, one who had long envied Griffin's success, emerged from the shadows, seeking to bring him down. This time, however, the challenge was personal. The stakes were no longer just about financial dominance. They were about the very integrity of everything Griffin had built. The rival had uncovered a vulnerability in Griffith's past, a long-buried mistake that could potentially tarnish his reputation. As Griffin became aware of the looming threat, he felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just a battle for his empire. It was a fight for his legacy. He couldn't afford to back down now, not when so much was at risk. It was time for one final confrontation, one that would determine whether he would remain on top or fall from grace. The accusations against him were shocking, yet Griffin refused to let them define his future. He began his counterattack with the same calculated precision that had earned him his place in the financial world. Every move was deliberate, every strategy designed to not only protect his empire but to expose his rival's motivations. Griffin knew that the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about proving he was right, it was about clearing his name. The legal and media battles that followed were relentless, but Griffith's confidence in his ability to navigate these treacherous waters never wavered. He knew that the truth would eventually surface, and when it did, his rival would have nowhere to hide. In the final stretch, Griffin's legal team and trusted allies worked tirelessly to ensure that the facts would prevail. The battle for his legacy was on, but Griffin was determined to see it through to the end. As the legal battle reached its climax, Griffin knew the time had come to take the fight to the public. His team launched a carefully orchestrated campaign, flooding the media with facts, counter-arguments, and key pieces of evidence that proved his innocence. The tide slowly began to turn. The public, once captivated by the scandal, started to see through the smoke and mirrors of his rival's accusations. Griffin's name once again was cleared. But as the storm subsided, Griffin realized something deeper had shifted within him. This battle had not just been for his reputation, it had been for his understanding of power and how easily it could be manipulated. He had learned the importance of controlling the narrative, and the fragility of success. Despite the victory, there was no satisfaction in this win. The true cost of the war had been paid in full, and Griffin had emerged victorious, but irrevocably changed. In the aftermath of the battle, Griffin's empire stood strong, but he found that the world he had once known had shifted. His rival, defeated, faded into the background, but Griffin knew that he was not invincible. His empire, once fueled by pure ambition, now felt more fragile than ever. The personal toll of the battle had been immense, relationships had been strained, and the trust he had once placed in people had been broken. Yet, Griffin had come to a new understanding. The market, like life, was unpredictable, and success could be fleeting. The only constant in this world was the need for adaptability. Griffin knew that the game was far from over. The financial world was in constant flux, and he had to remain vigilant. As he surveyed the empire he had built, Griffin realized that it was time to let go of the past and embrace the future. He was no longer the young trader who had stormed the market. He was a seasoned veteran, prepared to navigate the challenges ahead with wisdom and insight. In the quiet aftermath, Griffin found himself standing at a crossroads, facing a world that no longer seemed as predictable as it once had. The financial empire he had worked so tirelessly to build was secure, but his understanding of success had evolved. The battle for market dominance had given him everything he had ever wanted, but at what cost? He had won battles, but in doing so, he had lost parts of himself along the way. As he looked back, Griffin understood that his true legacy would not be measured by the wealth he accumulated or the power he held, but by the lessons he had learned. His journey had been about more than just conquering the market. It had been about learning to balance ambition with personal growth, and understanding that no matter how high one rises, the fall is always a possibility. Griffin stood tall, ready to move forward, knowing that the future was uncertain, but his ability to navigate it had never been sharper.